Hey everyone, today I want to take a look at Crash 4 and its dead zones, as well as request options to customize them. Getting into it, Crash 4 uses about a 25% square dead zone for its camera, so you have to move outside this region before you start seeing the camera move at all. Square dead zones restrict diagonal movement around the axes, so as you can see I can make these horizontal motions, but you don't see that conveyed. It is until you break out of these dead zones where you start seeing horizontal movement occur. That's the same around these the vertical axis. I can make these vertical movements, but don't see any vertical movement occurring until you break out of these dead zones. The camera is not too important. What is movement, and this shares those same 25% square dead zones. But there's a circular dead zone on top of that, increasing the general dead zone size. So as you can see, I have to move outside this rounded square region before the character begins moving. Like before, I can make these horizontal bobbing motions, but because it's square, it restricts diagonal movement around the axes. So I need to break out of this dead zone before diagonal movement starts occurring. The shaded region just represents the run threshold. Of course, the horizontal axes are restricted as well. With the way this is set up, this is most obvious around the dead zone, so if we trace it, you can see just how limited the diagonals are, and you can see how the character makes kind of a squarish path, tracing it like this. This dead zone is pretty common in many games, and this is specifically an improvement over the Insane Trilogy, both because this uses a smaller dead zone, has a wider walk range, and has slightly less restricted diagonal movement, though the implementations are different. And for Crash, having restricted diagonal movement like this is useful because there's a lot of jumps you'll make that are perfectly left and right, and perfectly forward and back. So having some guiding like this can help keep you on a perfectly straight movement. However, some players might not want this much restriction, and this is where options would help with that. So having a square dead zone option would let us control how much restricted diagonal movement we want. So if a player wants, say, 10% of their stick restricted, they could set that. If they want 0% or full diagonal movement, they could do that just by controlling the square dead zone option. A circular dead zone option would allow us to control the general size of the dead zone in conjunction with the square dead zone. One of the things that makes full diagonal movement in particular work with this game is that in most 2D sections you can't fall off the stage. So even if you're moving diagonally like this, you can't fall forward or back off the stage. And then for things like sliding is much more biased towards the horizontal axis in 2D sections, as well as Cortex's gun, where in 3D spaces like this, Cortex can shoot in any direction. In 2D spaces, he can only shoot in 4 directions: left, right, forward, and back. So even if you're pointing at an angle, you're still shooting in the correct direction, and so it doesn't affect 2D sections at all. So these different dead zones wouldn't affect any part of the game negatively. They would just cater to any specific player's preference. But I want to demonstrate what a circular dead zone would look like in comparison to this game's default dead zone. So I'll demonstrate that now by changing the overlays and enabling that. This is done by using a Titan 2, which changes the stick input. So set up a circular dead zone and then cancel the game's dead zone to illustrate this. So you can see that now moving the stick outside of the circle has the character move, and this dead zone is also smaller than default. And you can see that subtle angles are registered now, around the axis, and if I made the bobbing motions I did before, which weren't picked up, you can see that they're being conveyed now. If we trace the dead zone like we did before, you can see that the character moves in a much more circular path than they did previously. Now, of course, this is an extreme example. Some players might want restricted diagonal movement, and options would allow them to still maintain perfectly straight or more easily accessible perfectly straight directions. However, one of the benefits for full diagonal movement is that the character, of course, moves in the direction you point your stick, which is kind of very intuitive and natural feeling for 3D sections like this. And like I mentioned, in 2D sections, circular dead zones are perfectly viable because even if you're pointing at obvious angles, you can't fall off the stage, and all your kind of abilities are biased towards cardinal directions, so you don't really have to worry about the gameplay being affected with this. This ends up being more of a preference thing. Alright, so this is just going to be a short section showing the same circular dead zone I was demonstrating before with Cortex in one of his 3D sections. So as you can see, Cortex can shoot in any direction you're facing. But when you go to a 2D section like this, you can only shoot in 4 directions. Even when you're pointing at very obvious angles like this, you can only shoot in these directions. So the 2D gameplay is really unaffected, and as you can see, you can't fall forward or back off these stages. There is a bit of play, but you can, of course, point at these same directions, and it doesn't affect your jumps or anything like that. Dashing is even more generous in these sections, where subtle angles like this are still giving you full horizontal dashes. So as I said, like these dead zone requests don't really affect the gameplay at all negatively. They're just requesting them to cater to any specific player's preference, because of course the default controls the game uses work perfectly fine. But if you wanted to use a circular dead zone, this is playable throughout the entirety of the game, and any other amount of restricted diagonal movement would work as well. So options just allow players to find something that suits them specifically. Alright, so this is just going to be a demonstration of how these options would change things. You've already seen the default as well as the circular dead zone example that I gave, and to really set that up, all you'd have to do is set the square dead zone to 0 and circular dead zone to 20, and if we had these options, you'd be able to do it easily as that. And of course the defaults are about 25 and 10, but as I said, if some players want restricted diagonal movement but they think the current values are too much, they could lower it and use something like this, for example. And if they think this dead zone's too small, they can always raise it a bit with the circular dead zone, or make it smaller by lowering it. So this kind of caters to both players who want different amounts of cardinal like guiding, as well as this allows players to customize their dead zone size, just the size in general. So hopefully Toys for Bob will see this and consider adding this. Otherwise, thanks for watching and have a good rest of your day.